do we do when we approach recovery? And I'm going to talk about the difference between healing and recovery in a minute. But when you think of recovery, well, how do we get there? What does recovery even look like? How do we define recovery? Yes. So not back to where we were before, but even in a better place still. Okay. So some kind of growth that I'm a better person. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna separate healing and recovery. I believe that we heal from betrayal trauma. We don't recover from betrayal trauma. That's just how I look at it. I look at the language of healing. But that's just my opinion. You can use recovery any way you want. But so as to separate it out, a person in recovery, I'm looking at, has been recovering from what? What do we actually recover from in the addiction of recovery? Changing our thoughts. Because really, if you look at the recovery process, there's 4 primary things that we can change. So when we look at the recovery journey, I can change my thoughts. I can change how I'm thinking. I can change my emotions, how I feel. I can change my behaviors. If I've been acting out, I can abstain or move away from my behaviors. My thoughts, I can stop justifying behaviors. My emotions, if I'm having a difficult emotion, say stress, I could respond more effectively to my stress. Finally, so we got our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors, and then really when we look at the recovery process, you actually change your beliefs. When you've been acting out or you've been in betrayal trauma, the beliefs ultimately have to shift. So for example, you would shift from I am unlovable to I am a lovable person. I'm a person of worth. Because when you're active in addiction, you come to believe things about yourself. Shame. There's something wrong with me. I'm flawed. And so when you shift from that concept of I'm not enough to I am a lovable person, I am enough, you begin to change. So I'm going to shake things up for just a second. In our meetings, we say, hi, I am an addict. In today's world, some people are having a harder time with that. But could I also say that what else am I in addition to doing things that are addictive? Am I a good worker? Am I a good dad? Am I a good friend? Am I a good family member? So the perception of how we define ourselves in the recovery process needs to be a positive experience. It needs to be something that I am creating, I am doing. So when we look at the big picture of healing and recovery, we're not the same person that we once was. We become a different being. So let me give you an example. Most of us here will probably identify pretty readily that most people's sexual experiences begin before puberty. When I looked at the research online in today's upcoming generation, most people are exposed to pornography by the age of 11. We start to cross the threshold of influence of pornography in a person's life by age 11 or 12. What 11 or 12-year-old understands what those images are? Can you say it's hard to grasp? It's hard to make sense of that. But yet that's where most people are being exposed. So I'm exposed at this young age. How then do I define myself? If I'm exposed, how am I defining myself? By that exposure. And what happens is you begin to create a secret world. Not too many 11 or 12-year-olds actually say, hey, Mom, Dad, look what I'm viewing. What do you think? They hide the behavior. And when you've hidden a behavior, and I often do this, I will go back and say, okay, when I run a group, I'll say, let's go through your sexual history and let's start at the very beginning. What was your first exposure? What happened after that? What happened after that? Most people go back to pornographic images within the first month. That's what my research shows, is that people go back to the pornographic images within the first month. Well, if you go back at age 11, 12, 13, and then you start escalating it, most people in today's world, I can tell you, because I've got a survey online for people who've been acting out, that most people who by the time they're age 18 have been exposed to pornography 750 times or more. So if you've been exposed to pornography 750 times before you ever get into a meaningful, significant relationship, what does that do to you? How do you see yourself? How do you see relationships? Go ahead.
Can you help define what is pornography?
I'm going to just define it specifically as nudity, where I intentionally am looking at it, and that's where I will leave it. I mean, it could go anything from beyond that. I've actually, early in my career, interestingly enough, it was the JCPenney catalog. I was too young to actually see a JCPenney catalog, so I have no idea what that actually means, other than people would come to me. No, I'm not kidding. In the beginning of my career, people came in and said their first sexual experience was with JCPenney catalog. Okay, well, I still don't know what that means, but okay. So, and I'm talking specifically in this nudity, intentionally looked at.
I know what it means.
You do?
That was my go-to.
Yeah.
Or Sears.
Okay. So now I get to this point of, okay, so whatever your definition is, it's what it does to us as humans. What do I come to believe about myself? And this is where we see the most profound weakening of ourselves. Shame is probably the biggest factor that prevents recovery and healing, both partners. So what's the voice of shame? Something's wrong with me. I'm not enough. So if I've been carrying this secret for 5, 10, 15 years, a few years ago I was doing a class, and I asked this guy, I said, hey, would you be, I looked for a volunteer, I said, hey, so I asked this guy to come up, and I said, okay, could you tell me your age of first exposure to pornography? He said, I was 8 years old. I said, okay, what happened after 8? Next time. Oh, it was a few months later. What about that? When did it get its worst? And we just went on, and he's in front of a group of people, and he says, we're just going through this, boom, 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 and just laying out this involvement with pornography. And then what happened? And who did you tell? I didn't tell anybody. And this guy, at this point, he was in his late 20s, and he'd been literally keeping this secret for over 20 years. I said, so when's the first time you told anybody about your use of pornography? He said, today, right here, right now. The group was like, right? I mean, he just literally, we went through his whole sexual history. And as it unfolded, I mean, every guy in this room was like, just in, you know. What did you come to believe about yourself? Nobody would ever want me. I'll never be enough. And you can see the shame embedded right there. Now let's take it the other side. Now you're married. How do you communicate about this with a partner? Generally speaking, we don't. So now we have secrets that are now embedded in relationships. And if we're going to look at the big overarching picture of recovery, then it always comes with transparency. The ability to communicate and talk. So when I look at human connections, I say, if I could revise how we do dating, we'd have a pretty open conversation about our sexuality and our eating and our perceptions of spending money. We would have a meaningful conversation about these topics because so many times we get into relationships we're so afraid of being vulnerable. But I once read a study that said the more open you can be, the more connected you can be. Because you're seen. All right, so I want to give you some very specific tools. And this is the big picture of recovery for both partners. I'm going to start off dealing with the person who's been acting out. There's a concept called recovery capital. Has anyone heard the term recovery capital? No? Anyone? Anna Lemke? Recovery capital, in the research on addiction recovery, and I'm talking addiction in general, drugs and alcohol, they studied people who've been successful. And they study these people because they actually have money in drug and alcohol recovery because it's killing people. We don't care about relationships. We're not going to give money to people studying sex addiction or sexual betrayal. We're not going to give them money. But we're going to give millions and millions of dollars to stop it because drugs and alcohol are killing people. So they studied people who've been successful. What have you been doing? And they identified 10 categories of what successful people do in recovery. And they called it recovery capital. And the more capital you had, the more likely you were to succeed. Unfortunately, in today's world, we think that if you attend a 12-step group, or you talk with a counselor, or you talk with a religious leader, that you're working on your recovery. But I'm going to tell you, going to a 12-step group meeting once a week is a deposit in the bank. But when you're dealing with a tremendous amount of stress, a small deposit in the bank is not sufficient for what you need during difficult times. So if you're going to succeed, this is what the researchers found with drugs and alcohol, you need as much recovery capital as you can possibly get. So here's what that might look like, and I'm just going to paint a quick picture. With recovery capital, you might be attending a 12-step group, and you might be talking with your sponsor, and you're going to counseling, and you've got a whole team of accountability, and you're looking at your own emotions and how to deal with stress, and you're reading books on your own, and you're in an environment that helps you succeed. When I say living environment, check out your environment. Is your environment conducive to healing and recovery? Well, let me talk about the environment. Do you have devices that are easily accessible to pornography or to other sexual apps? If a person's been acting out, they always have a ritual. They always have a pattern. You have to make it so it's not so easy to jump off the cliff. Most people relapse because of stress. That's the number one reason that people get for a relapse. So how do you respond to stress? And if you're going to add recovery capital, that means you have to add strategies for when you're dealing with stress. And so now we start saying, I do have a sponsor. I am reaching out. I am being accountable. I have a group support. I am doing all of these things. Now I've got enough deposits in the bank so when stress comes, I have a strategy or a solution. So now I'm going back to where I started. What can we change? Our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors, and our beliefs about self. So what happens when I attend a group? I start to think differently because I see other people working recovery. What happens when I call up my sponsor? I start to change my behavior. Instead of acting out, I call up my sponsor. Now it's a behavioral change. So I'm actually, instead of waiting till after a relapse, I'm calling my sponsor before a relapse. And what you begin to see is the recovery capital builds and you get more momentum and more momentum. So if I can put recovery in one summary, is you build your recovery capital. And it's not one thing, it's multiple things. Yes, I'm talking with a spiritual leader because I want their spiritual guidance. That's another part of recovery capital. I'm being accountable to many people, not just one person. I'm reading on my own so I can learn what healthy people do in recovery. And now I've started to build a whole web of concepts that protect me, because many times I've found that people say, well, I went to a group, or I did talk with my religious leader, or I went to counseling. Great, but what else were you doing? So we build recovery capital so we can succeed long term. And they studied people who've been successful in drug and alcohol recovery, and they found that those who had the highest levels of capital were the most successful over 5 and 10-year periods of time. So, build your recovery capital. Now let me talk to the betrayed partner. So many times when I've talked with betrayed partners, I hear a statement like this: why do I have to do this work? Why do I have to do anything? They're the ones who acted out. They're the ones who created all this crap and mess and pain in my life. Why do I have to do anything? What's the answer? Did I hear someone say PTSD? So I have a simple question. Are you sleeping okay at night? Do you ever have nightmares? Do you ever have flashbacks? Have you found you're avoiding people and places that you used to like going? Do you find yourself avoiding some of your own thoughts? What have you come to believe about yourself as a result of your partner's behavior? And do you find yourself angrier than you've ever been? Do you find yourself monitoring your partner more than you ever have? And typically about that point, they're like, all right, you can live with that if you want. Or you can understand how to deal with it and learn to treat those behaviors or those symptoms. So, the recovery journey for me for betrayed partners is working through the PTSD symptoms. My research, as I said earlier, my research is very clear. And again, this is worldwide. Somewhere between 70 and 80% of people are experiencing many of the PTSD symptoms. So, it's not that you have to do that in terms of your healing. It's that if you want to be able to be the real you, you work through those symptoms. So in two contexts, you have people working their own healing and recovery journey. And by the way, when you start doing your own healing, you're going to bump into things that you might not like a memory from the past that you thought you were through. I was working with an individual who said, I know it's just this relationship, and if they wouldn't have done this, I said, okay, so has there ever been any other time in your life where you felt this way? And that's about the time I get called a name. Stupid therapist. Make me cry. And she said, no, that's so much like when I was 14 years old. I didn't know the story. But in that specific case, that 14-year-old was being re-traumatized to a high level because of what her partner was doing triggered a 14-year-old girl's memory. It doesn't always happen that way. But we begin to see how things are linked together. So when else have I felt this way, like I'm not enough, that I'm unlovable? And then we begin to work through it. I was doing a group, just to give you an example of application. What I do is called attachment-focused EMDR. I don't know if anyone's familiar with attachment-focused EMDR. It's one of my favorite strategies or tools to use as a therapist because it brings in attachment into the trauma work. And this in particular case, it's called Finding a Safe Place. I had the group creating a safe place, and you ask for three specific things. I want you to find someone who is a nurturer to you, somebody who is a protector for you, and somebody who is a wise person. And we identified three separate beings or people. And interestingly enough, I said it doesn't have to be a living person. Doesn't have to be a living person. It could be somebody who's dead, a grandparent. It could be anybody, or they don't have to be alive. It could be, or not alive. They don't have to have ever lived. It could be a superstar. Well, this individual in particular chose Iron Man to be her protector. I don't care. I'm just the therapist here. I'm just doing my job. All right, and so we're doing this attachment focus. This is a group exercise, and she's there. She's doing what we call the butterfly tap. It's just like this, tap, tap, tap. And I just said, we're just creating a safe place. I want you to imagine that you're identifying a safe place to you. It could be the beach. It could be the mountains. It could be in your own room. Doesn't matter, but your challenge is just to find a safe place for you. And then I just want you to imagine in your body that you're just right hand on left shoulder here, and you just imagine yourself being there. Your feet are on the ground. You're relaxed as possible. And so I invited the nurturer to be there with her, with them that they've invited. So the nurturer is there in the safe place. the protector, the wise person, and we're just, what did you feel with what these, that's the experience, right? It's just a really simple, relaxing experience in the safe place. So we're doing this, and I get to this final part, and I say, now what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to bring any of those characters with you, and just say thanks to them and whatever else. And so she's tapping, and she gets, all of a sudden, she's just like, emotionally, she's just like, whoo. I'm like, whoo. And the group's like, what just happened? And she took Iron Man to a case where she was abused as a little girl, and Iron Man kicked the crap out of somebody who hurt her. And she's sharing this with a group. And I'm like, I wasn't prepared for this. And she was so delighted that Iron Man was there to help her. Now, I share that story because there's something that's really important here. If we're going to heal, we do it in relationships. The exercise that I just explained to you is taking a safe place, or even in her situation, she took a traumatic experience, and she had support in the traumatic moment. Healing and recovery, if you look at the research, and again, I'm across the board, people heal in relationships. If you've been acting out, it's in your relationships that you can heal. In addiction, you typically isolate and keep yourself away from people. In recovery, you don't ever stay in isolation. It's like, anyone read any of James Pennebaker's work? James Pennebaker was a fighter pilot in Vietnam. His plane was shot down. He was in the Hanoi Hilton for 7 years in isolation. We did one of the most stupid things as a country at that time. They had them fly exactly the same route in Vietnam every day, same time. His plane shot down. So here he is in this place, and he's 7 years in isolation. And James Pennebaker teaches a great lesson. And it's this. Here I was flying solo, expecting not to get shot down. And I flew the same place every day, same time. Shoot me down, please. Shoot me down. And I think that's what happens when we fly solo in the recovery journey. We're trying to change a behavior. I told you that the average person has viewed pornography more than 750 times by the time they're 18. Same time, same thing. I'm fine. I don't need help. I got it. I can do it. If you're going to change, you have to interrupt every pattern that you have. If you've been acting out at a certain time of the day or a certain situation, you have to interrupt this time and the space. That's why we need accountability, someone to reach out to, someone to talk to, because we don't want to fly solo. Flying solo gets you shot down. So we don't fly solo. When you're in betrayal trauma, keeping it to yourself. I was talking with a woman, and she had literally kept what her husband had done quiet for over 15 years. She held it on all by herself. Do you know what she told me? She said, I was sick. My body was weak. My immune system was weak. I was sick all the time. And everyone asked, what's wrong with your health? What's wrong with your health? What's wrong with your health? And she said, I didn't have the courage to say, my partner's been cheating on me for 20 years. So for 15 years, she just kept it secret because she was protecting what? It was killing her. So we find a safe place to talk and communicate. It's a principle of recovery. It's a principle of healing. If you're going to heal and you're going to try to do it on isolation, I promise you it's going to take much longer. If you're going to connect with people, if you're going to get support, if you're going to have accountability, that connection is a game changer. This is Dr. Skinner's opinion, so just take this as my opinion. The difference between SA Lifeline and a 12-step group done by, say, ARP, the most important difference is you have an opportunity for a sponsor. Yes, you can go to SA2. My point is, if you don't have a sponsor and you don't have that kind of accountability, it just is going to take longer. It's just going to be harder. I don't have anything against ARP. I don't have anything. I just simply say, you need somebody to say, in the moment of crisis, I need help now. And if you don't have that help now, flying over the same enemy territory day in, day out, day in, day out. Statistically speaking, I wouldn't bet on you. You've done something 750 times, and you're thinking, oh, I got it this time. I got it this time. I got it this time. It's not how recovery works. So we build the recovery capital. We get lots of support. We talk with people. We get group support. I want to speak for just a second about spiritual support for just a second. A lot of religious leaders have struggled knowing how to respond both to people acting out and people who've been betrayed. There's been a lot of struggles. Sometimes, this is going to sound a little strange, we have to teach them what we need. I need you just to listen to my pain. I need you just to listen and feel what I'm experiencing. Right now, I'm not asking for spiritual guidance, because I'm going to tell you the spiritual battle intensifies in both partners immensely after discovery. Before discovery in the person who's been acting out, the spiritual battle is always intense. But in the betrayed partner, there's almost always a significant shock to the spiritual system. I've seen far too many women leave their religious beliefs because of how people have responded. If that's you, I plead with you to hold to your spiritual ties to a higher power. There can be peace there in ways that are hard to find, but they exist. It's hard enough to not be able to trust a partner. It's even more difficult to be mad at God. But let me address God for a second. If you're mad at God, stand in line. God has really thick skin. And he knows you're suffering. And sometimes he can't make your partner change, because he can bring peace to your soul. He didn't create this. He gave people agency and they chose it. So I'm sorry if you're not spiritual. I actually don't apologize. And the reason why is because in my mind, we're all spiritual beings. I don't care what your spiritual belief is. I believe that if we attune to our minds and our bodies, there's a spirit part of us that is craving for spiritual connection with a higher power. We find it in nature. We find it in our relationships. But he's there. She's there. They're there. All right. This is really quick. I need to just open it up for questions. Are there questions? Do you guys have questions? I'm more than willing to answer questions. There's a couple of things I'd like to close with, but yes, please stand up and speak loud. I'll restate it. When do I suggest couples therapy begin? Okay, that is a phenomenal question. In fact, maybe I should just do that part of it. Great, thank you. All right, so couples therapy. You've been in a car crash. You're just doing discovery. Let's define couples therapy. What is couples therapy? Are we trying to repair the relationship? I'm going to tell you the first phase is we aren't trying to repair the relationship. The first phase is we're trying to understand what happened in this accident. You're not making a decision about your relationship because you don't have the data or the information. So the first step is, as I said earlier, we have to stop and orient ourselves and gather data. I don't know how you've been acting out. I don't know how long you've been acting out. How can I make a decision of whether I'm going to stay or go? So the first phase, the person who's been acting out probably doesn't even know the depth of their problem. So both partners have to do a significant amount of self-work and somehow be married in that process. That's one of the most difficult things as a therapist, because people call up and say, hey, this XYZ happened. We want to do couples therapy. What in the crap is couples therapy in that first phase? I call it survival phase, so you don't kill each other. And that first phase is literally we're just trying to hold down the fort long enough to find out what happened in this car accident and to make an informed decision. So for me, first phase, if you want to call that couples work, it's probably survival and understanding. And in that process, we begin and we prepare to do a disclosure, an impact letter, and an emotional restitution letter. We begin that process. Sometimes that takes months because people have such an extensive history of their sexually acting out behaviors and their own trauma that we have to do an incredible amount of individual work before we can really get to the connection part of couples work. So phase-wise, we do a significant amount of individual work with periodic couples work to make sure that they have what I call the rules for fighting. So I've created what's called 7 rules for fighting so you don't kill each other. It's just a really simple concept based upon some of the research of John Gottman. And really, most couples at this early phase, they're saying and fighting in ways that are really hurtful to the relationship. But that's normal, right? You guys have never fought? Oh, seriously, right? Am I off on this one? Okay, thank you. I got a voice of one, thank you. But at this phase, most people they're fighting, and their shame is high, and there's continued gaslighting and minimizing of behaviors. And you can't connect in a real meaningful way while you're still in addiction. And when you're in high trauma, you're not able to connect either because you don't feel safe enough with this person. So couples work, you literally have to get the couple to a place where they can start to hear and feel in different ways. And I'm not saying that we aren't doing things together as a couple. It's just not deep bonding intimacy. It's really survival. So whatever you want to call that first phase, call it. But if you're trying to do couples connection work there, it doesn't work very well. Sue Johnson, one of the best therapy approaches for marriage and family therapists, is called emotionally focused therapy. She says in her third book that she does not recommend emotionally focused therapy, which creates deep connection, if a person's active in addiction or in trauma. So even our best professionals are saying we're not trying to create connection too early or prematurely, because if you do it prematurely, let's say that you try a really good couples exercise where they communicate and there's a lot of closeness, a lot of affection, and then we do a disclosure. And now I discovered you did this and this and this and this. Well, what does that connection work mean now? Do you understand what I'm saying here? So we have to space it and phase it step by step in an understood way. So when couples come to me, I ask them, how long are you going to be in for this? Because if you're in for the short term, I don't have that pill. I have people here that I've seen or know, or I've been aware of their situations, and I see people here who've been doing therapy for years. And I applaud them. I applaud them because I know the work that they're doing. It's phases. So the first phase is the muck and the gunk and the gick and the ugh of discovery. The middle phase is a really difficult phase because you're dealing with your own traumas, your own addictive behaviors, and you're doing a lot of self-work here. Early on, you're doing self-discovery and understanding. Now you're doing your trauma work. You're understanding the trauma from your childhood. You're understanding the secrets that you held, how you lied, how you deceived, how you manipulated. And if you've been traumatized, you're doing your own work, healing your PTSD symptoms. And at that point, you start to turn and understand yourself more, and that allows you to be more relational. Now, at that point, you also begin to we do the disclosure, we do the impact letter, and the emotional restitution. These are 3 letters. The disclosure is the person who's been acting out. The emotional restitution is the betrayed partner reads a letter to their partner about how the betrayal influenced them. And then we do an emotional restitution, which is addressing the gaslighting and how it hurt the relationship. So both partners are understanding each other. At that point, we really begin the couple's work, and we begin it in earnest at that point. because we now understand the car crash, the implications, we understand our own histories, and now you know my story, I know your story, we are more likely to be able to do couples work, understanding each other at a deeper level. The patterns still are difficult to break, because really we're trying to break unhealthy patterns in the coupleship. And that is a quick summary of what we do in about 2 or 3 years. Can I say this, though? It is absolutely stunning when you watch a couple love each other again. It's absolutely one of the most beautiful things to ever witness. When they're bawling in your office because they finally are seeing each other, and both partners are truly seeing that person, it's absolutely beautiful. In fact, the privilege of witnessing that is one of my life's greatest experiences. When I've seen people who haven't seen each other for years start to see each other again, I absolutely rejoice. We need couples to figure this out. There is help and there is guidance. It's there. But we've got to step up and do the work. And if you'll do it, there are professionals, there are people in groups and support, there are people who want to help. And I assume that's why you're here, because you'd want that help. All right, I got 5 minutes. Please. Can betrayal trauma be lessened by understanding addiction as a disease? Betrayal trauma can be lessened by understanding the disease. And now let me add all the other parts that go with it. Okay? So my answer to your question is yes, but let me put a caveat on that. If I use addiction as a disease to justify my behavior over and over and over again, it does not help my betrayed partner. If I take ownership and say, I am struggling with this, and this is my challenge, and I'm working and I'm doing the things that I've talked about, recovery, doing the disclosure, understanding, seeking to understand my partner, then yes, them understanding this is a battle and my story can be very helpful. But I have to say, if I'm using it as an excuse and I'm not doing the work and I'm not engaging in that process, then it doesn't mean anything. So it's still contingent upon the effort from my heart. Now, let me speak to a couple other things that I think are really critical. In the overarching recovery process, we have to learn to be more relational. This is my soapbox. I believe that the greatest distractor from everything we're doing is that we aren't good in relationships. We have to learn how to have empathy for people in pain without it overwhelming our system. We have to learn compassion. We have to understand those core principles, because every relationship that I've seen succeed, they have empathy and compassion in the healing. Compassion means being with people in their suffering. So I'm going to say this and do this real quick. I'm sorry, what was your name when you came up and asked your question? Paul. Paul asked me a beautiful question earlier. And I just want to say something. Paul probably wasn't given he didn't get his story heard by his partner. For whatever reason. I'm not going to blame her on anything. I'm just simply saying Paul wanted to be heard. Am I right, Paul? Every one of us wants to be heard. We want to be understood. Your partner might not be that person who can do it in the beginning. Your partner might not be that person. That's why we have a sponsor. That's why we get a friend or a group to go to. The reason why we get support is because in the beginning, our partner might be too emotionally charged to be with us in our pain. So the power of a group or the power of a sponsor, the power of a friend or a religious leader is to be able to have your story heard by somebody who's safe enough for you to speak your truth. And then I can speak more authentically about my pain. There's nobody who's been acting out who isn't in pain, that doesn't have a story of suffering. It doesn't mean that your partner will be able to hold your story, though. But everybody's story needs to be heard, because there's a lot of suffering. Your story matters.
Being honest with those people about the betrayed.
If they're doing those things and not doing it with their spouse, then they're really not in recovery. They're not doing the work. The person who matters the most will have that story. And if they choose not to share it with their spouse, we've got to figure out why not, what that barrier is. If you can share it with everybody else but your partner, then we've got some work we got to do. The question was, what if they're being honest with everybody else but their spouse? I'd say, if I was a sponsor or a friend or a religious leader or whatever, I'd say, does your spouse know this? And if the answer is no, then we have to address that. Have to. They're not in recovery if they're keeping secrets from you, period. Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point.
Is that progress?
I would say it's progress if they're sharing their story. But you, if you're the partner there, matter the most. So you can tell the whole world your story, but if you don't share parts of it and what you're struggling with your partner, that's a secret. It hurts. Sorry. Okay, question.
Speaking of excuses that addicts use, what are common excuses that they use and how do these betrayed?
Probably the most common excuses were, we weren't just having enough sex. And if we would have had enough sex, I would have been just fine. How do we break it down? Thank you. How do we break it down? How do we stop it? I can hear, if I was role playing with you, I can hear what you're saying, that you want more sex. My question to you is, if we were having more sex, do you really think that would change your behavior that's been going on for 20 years? How often do we have sex and you still have cravings for XYZ? What's the truth? What's the real battle like? And I invite you to consider that, because right now you're saying that if I did this, my question to you is, what would you do? Right? What's your real battle like? And I don't know what your real battle is like. I'd love to find out, though. All right, question back there. If a person is in deep addiction, is it worth sharing your pain? Did I understand that correctly? My belief is that you share limited amount. That hurts, but I don't expect that they're going to be able to give you a whole lot of empathy if they're in active behaviors. Let me give you an example of that. There's plenty of research for this. If your shame is high, man, I'm sorry, I could go on. I've only got a couple more minutes. In fact, I'm over. I apologize. If your shame is high, the research shows your empathy is low. So if you are living in shame, the research shows that your empathy is low. So what you've just described based on research, my belief is a person in active behavior, shame is high. It's harder to feel other people's pain. And one of the greatest measurements that I use in the recovery process is the ability to feel empathy, which is why we teach empathy skills to all people in healing and recovery journey.